So this week we are looking at identifying cultural influence on modes of communication and perception. And I have this article for you guys to read. You'll notice it was published this year, so it's fairly recent research, which is awesome anytime that we have something that's new. But the article is Nonverbal Communication and Cross-Cultural Learning, Insights from a Native Speaker. And I just want to cover the major points or go over the major points that are covered in this article together before you have a quiz over it. So the article argues that in multilingual and multicultural classrooms, like a cross-cultural understanding class, communication really goes beyond words, and those nonverbal cues help bridge gaps in language and culture. Because students may come from different linguistic backgrounds, nonverbal cues, and we're talking about hand gestures, facial expressions, voice tone, etc., those really become a critical complement or sometimes substitute for verbal communication. And the method that this research was done, it was done by observation. And the researchers observed one native English speaker teaching or interacting with 20 non-native students in a cross-cultural understanding classroom. They used structured observations like video recordings and field notes, applying a checklist of nonverbal behaviors to see how the native speaker used those nonverbal strategies. And some of those nonverbal strategies employed by the native speaker, they were identified that the native speaker used really a variety of nonverbal cues intentionally to support communication. And these included body movements and gestures to illustrate, point out, and emphasize, facial expressions like smiling, eyebrow movement to convey meaning or emotional tone. They also use vocalics and paralanguage, changing in tone, volume, pacing, proxemics and spatial arrangement, how close or how far in the classroom, using space to manage attention. Also environmental cues and use of objects, using the classroom environment or physical materials as communicative aids. And finally, communication objects, so like visual aids and gestures towards those objects. And then some of the functions or the roles of nonverbal cues in the classroom, such as clarifying meaning. Nonverbal cues help disambiguate verbal messages, especially when students' language comprehension was partial. Maintaining student engagement, so gestures, facial expressions, movement help keep their attention, signaling shifts, emphasizing or checking for understanding. Building rapport and relational connection, so friendly expressions, posture movement that signaled openness and helped build trust and reduce the distance between the teacher and the student. And then bridging cultural differences. The native speaker's nonverbal strategies really functioned as a mediator, helping reduce misunderstanding across cultural frames. So for this study, what pedagogical implications or recommendations did this study find? Nonverbal communication should not be viewed as merely auxiliary. It must be purposefully used and taught in those cross-cultural classrooms. Educators should really develop intercultural competence and nonverbal cues, knowing how those gestures, space, facial expressions, and tone may be interpreted differently by students from diverse cultural backgrounds. Remember, last week we talked about a thumbs up. In Western culture, a thumbs up is a good thing. But in some Eastern cultures, a thumbs up is the same as the middle finger. So, really knowing your audience and what cues are acceptable culturally and not, that's very important. Teachers should reflect and adapt their nonverbal style. For example, moderating gestures, adjusting that space position between you and the student. Coming too close to a student, some people are not comfortable with that just in general, but also it's in some cultures, men and women should not be that close together. So really understanding that. Using visual aids also. Observation and just a little bit of feedback from the video-based reflection, you're going to read about this towards the end, that might help teachers become more aware of their nonverbal behaviors if they can watch themselves and see it. So those of you that are going on to teach, you'll have to do like teaching demonstrations, and you'll get feedback from your professor at that time. And it's not a bad thing to like record yourself and see how you interact with students and see which ways you can make yourself better in those interactions, and also how they impact different learners. So those are just the major points that are covered in this article. You do have a very short multiple choice question quiz over the article, so make sure you go through and you take your time reading it so that you are successful on the quiz.